Don't sack you, James. James says, once more, cause over comfort. He stands up. He says, don't you be losing your job. I'll take the hit. And he resigns from the Singer factory.
Crucially, America introduced James to a new trade union, the Industrial Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies. They were promoting a new concept of one big union fighting for all general and unskilled workers, much to the displeasure of employers. After leaving Singer, Connolly became an organiser for the Wobblies in Manhattan. I was interested to learn from present-day Labour leader Joe Duffy just how dangerous it would have been for James back then standing up for workers' rights.
At the beginning of the 20th century here in New York, when Connolly arrived, surely politically must have been one of the most exciting places on earth.
At the time that Connolly was here, there's a lot more industrial violence than there was either in the Ireland that he left or in Ireland, say, in recent decades. But he was active with the Industrial Workers of the World, which was a syndicalist organization, which had come out of the Western Federation of Miners. Now, a mine strike in the U.S. at the turn of the 20th century was almost like a civil war. You had goon squads from the employers, and the miners were not shy about returning gunfire for gunfire. So when he went back to Ireland, which in 1910, which was experiencing this ascending curve of industrial violence leading to the big lockout in 1913, Connolly was the one who had the brains and the intelligence and the experience to organize the citizen army.
What's his legacy here in the States?
He was one of the founders of industrial unionism and the thinking behind it. That not only influenced a later generation of U.S. trade union organizers, it influenced people in Scotland, it influenced people in Britain, and in Ireland it's the legacy of uniting the national and the social.
It's obvious you admire him.
Absolutely. He was the most serious of men. He was not a dilettante in any way, didn't hang around in cocktail parties with intellectuals. He would prefer to be out speaking German or Italian and organizing real workers into unions or into the Socialist Party. And it was the moral nobility of the man. He asked a lot of his family in terms of not being around, and his wife especially, Lily. They put up with the sacrifices, and if you read the works of his daughters, they revered him. He was a hero. He was larger than life to them, not only to his union colleagues.
Just as in Ireland, Connolly's profile as a Labour campaigner in New York meant that he was unable to earn a regular income, and as a result his family was still destitute. But then for James, the cause was always more important than comfort.
It's 1910, James Connolly is 42 years of age. They've been 7 years here in the States, himself, Lily, and now 6 kids. Remember, they left Dublin to get away from the tenements. They're here in New York. Where are they living again? In a tenement. James is working all the days that God will give him, union organiser, selling pamphlets, writing pamphlets, travelling all over the country. Still, they could not make ends meet.
Connolly wrote at the time about the working man who would spend his one day off every week in bed just to save his family the price of a meal. You knew he wasn't making it up, that this was written from personal experience. He was scraping by and trying to make a difference in America, but James never forgot Ireland and the poverty and the inequality he had left behind.
And you could see by what he was writing that he was thinking of only one thing, and that was going back home. For example, he wrote, "For its freedom, the Irish working class must emancipate itself, and in emancipating itself, it must perforce free its country." You can tell that Ireland was getting closer. In 1910, James gets an invitation back to Ireland for a speaking tour. He says to Lily, "We're going back." Lily says, "Remember the misery that we endured there." James replies, "I'd rather be poor in Ireland than a millionaire here in America." The Connollys were going back home.
James returned to an Ireland where the workers still faced the same terrible living and working conditions he'd emigrated from. But there was now a growing level of social unrest. Connolly immediately joined Jim Larkin in the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, and they began to coordinate strikes in industrial hubs like Belfast, Dublin and Wexford. There was a feeling in Ireland that a fuse was being lit beneath a powder keg.
James Connolly wasn't just a visionary, he was also very, very hard-headed. For him, socialism wasn't just about the head, it was about the stomach, it was about people coming together for basic rights and acting together for basic rights. So Connolly moved from thinking to doing, from speaking out to standing up. The weaker the victim, the greater his indignation. And at the core of each issue was dignity, self-respect, holding your head up high. And with Larkin and Connolly together standing up for the workers, this was bound to irritate the very people who took advantage of cheap, unskilled labour.
Publisher and tramway owner William Martin Murphy led Dublin's employers against workers' demands and unionisation. Murphy was also a supporter of Home Rule, whereas Connolly had always believed that Home Rule just meant replacing greedy British bosses with greedy Irish ones. Their war of words and ideas finally came to a head in 1913 with the lockout. 20,000 workers and 300 employers squared up for one of the most severe and significant industrial disputes in modern history. Neither side had any intention of compromising.
The employers brought in scab labour from the countryside and from across the water. The Catholic Church objected to the children of strikers being taken to England to be looked after because of the unholy influence it might have on them. But at one stage, James got a group of hungry children and marched them up to Archbishop's Palace and suggested that he show as much interest in their stomachs as he had in their souls.
For 7 months, the lockout affected tens of thousands of Dublin's workers and their families. The strikers used mass pickets and intimidation against strike breakers, while the police baton-charged rallies, even killing 2 workers on what is now O'Connell Street during one notorious protest, the first Bloody Sunday. In response, Larkin and Connolly formed a workers' militia, the Irish Citizen Army, a force to protect workers and their demonstrations. The lockout was the embodiment of everything Connolly had spent his life standing up for, fighting for the decency of the working class. But would it bring about the workers' republic he dreamed of? By early 1914, the locked-out workers and their families were on the brink of starvation, and the writing was on the wall for Connolly and the union leadership.
Connolly and Larkin could not get the support of the British TUC or offers of sympathetic strikes in England. Workers returned to work and signed agreements not to be part of a union. The workers' revolution had failed.
It was a terrible blow to the workers and to Connolly, but the knock-on effects were even more telling. Big Jim Larkin left Ireland for America, and in a despairing echo of Connolly's own young life, many of the striking lockout workers now chose a wage and enlisted to fight for king and country with the outbreak of World War I.
Although Connolly had been in exactly the same situation as a 14-year-old in Edinburgh, as indeed members of my own family were here, he was heartbroken that the working people of Europe were enlisting to fight each other. He said, "I would rather an Irishman die fighting for class freedom in his own country than in a foreign country fighting for profiteers."
Connolly jokingly used to say when he was job hunting that he was looking for a new exploiter. Harry Crosby is one of Ireland's most successful employers, based in the same docks where Connolly fought his lockout. But he's also a friend and someone who likes a good argument. I thought he might give me an alternative perspective on the great James Connolly.